of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Well, by now you've probably figured out that I am indeed not Reverend Audrey. Those of you for whom it may be your first time, our interim rector, Audrey, is at home sick today, so I am covering for her, which is always fun when you get that call on Saturday afternoon saying, "Hey, can you preach for me?" Sure. So I sat down with the readings, and fortunately, this was not one of those weeks where I had to sit down with every commentary in sight and figure out what in the heck am I going to say. This week's readings are very rich and very full of great wisdom. Last Monday night, I went down to Capital One Cafe over on South Broadway, I believe, and attended a town hall hearing for the public on the relocation of the Trinity Center to a temporary location on Metella Street. Now, the only reason that we are doing any relocation, because it's already been enough of a challenge to warm up this neighborhood to the reality of the great ministry that we are doing at Trinity Center, it was important to make sure we went through these steps. I have to admit, I was very impressed with one lady who, instead of doing the hand-wringing, "Well, we support what you're doing, but do you have to do it in ours?" She said, "I'm going to be politically incorrect and say it. I don't want this in my backyard." I thought, well, alrighty then. You just tell us how you really feel. And her story was that she dealt with family members who were on the streets who refused to get help. She dealt with lots of mental illness of homeless neighbors in San Jose. And she had moved to Walnut Creek to get away from that. And what did we think we were doing, putting that very thing that she tried to get away from in her own backyard? What I appreciated about that experience was, besides the fact that my ire and the ire of several other people was heightened, I had to practice my skills of communication theory, going, what is her deeper story? Well, first of all, fear. Fear is a common thing we all hold to. It's hard enough when you have to worry about taking care of your belongings. It's hard enough when you're afraid of people you don't know that don't look savory. The people in both the time of Moses and the time of Paul were dealing with people enslaving them, oppressing them, threatening them, where they had no room to speak up, they had no room to be cared for as much. So to say love your enemies and give them good things is a tall order for all of us. Now, you might have noticed that when I read the gospel this morning, I pronounced a particular word in a weird way. We mispronounce the word as when we say Satan. Satan is not a name. Satan is a title. Ha-Satan is Hebrew for the accuser, the adversary. For those of you who may not know ancient theologies, it was understood that there was a heavenly kingdom. One of the words for God in the Old Testament is Elohim, which is plural, because God was the head honcho, and God had supernatural beings that were in his court. Some were advocates, some were adversaries. People had different roles. Well, Ha-Satan wasn't evil in that framework. Ha-Satan was the one who went around the world and saw what people were doing wrong, brought it to God's attention to point out where people need to be, chastised. That role eventually evolved over time. But what's interesting, and something that I always was confused by as a kid, was like, wow, Jesus, that was pretty harsh to call Peter Satan right after you just named him the rock on which you would build your church. Well, my understanding based on that reading was that Jesus was telling Peter, you don't get it. You were tempting me to something that I want but need to not do. Now, who here has ever thought they understood what they were supposed to do in their relationship to God and then found out very quickly that it was not what they expected? Go ahead, raise your hands. It's also funny that a friend of mine pointed out to me that I had never noticed in the Moses story is that the burning bush was burning but not being consumed, But it was only when Moses decided, you know what? I'm not going to stick to business as usual. I've got to check that out. That's really interesting. When God noticed, it's like, oh, well, Moses is checking this out. Let's get his attention. It's almost as though God took that as an opportunity, maybe rather than God was the one in the burning bush originally. That was an interesting little nuance there. But I like what it says, because yet again, God often does not come to us in the places that we expect. Moreover, God often leads us into things that we don't always want to do, or we're not necessarily just or fair. Imagine you have been dealing with injustice and oppression and hatred and fear your whole life for this outside people that have taken over your country. Imagine this figure that comes up who is hoped for all these centuries, that would raise up an army and kick them out, that would restore your dignity, finally, that was supposed to be the leader to give you safety. And then he turns around after you say, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of God, you are the one that's going to give us our safety back. Turns right around and says, oh, and by the way, I have to go to Jerusalem and be crucified and suffer. After that I'll rise again, but not until after that. That's devastating. That would make me go, excuse me, has anyone ever had a spiritual leader that suddenly told them they needed to do something they didn't want to do because it was dangerous or uncomfortable? Come on, don't be shy. Moses also wasn't exactly excited about his calling. He had run away from Egypt because he'd killed a fellow Egyptian. Not a good thing to go back to when you're already an outlaw. I don't think there were statutes of limitations in ancient Egypt. You notice that he made excuses over and over again. Well, what am I to call you? What am I to say to them? Later on he says, I have a stutter, I can't speak. And so God relents and says, fine, take your brother Aaron, but I'm calling you to this. We are in a time where we live in relative safety, but we are continually polarized by disconnection through internet trolling, through the idea that we have to be absolutely right about our viewpoints in any manner of things, whether it be religion, politics, culture, heritage, all these different things that continue to divide us as a people. What I like is that God calls us to treat everyone, every single person in the world, with the same dignity. It's in our baptismal covenant to respect the dignity of every human being. With both the story of Moses going back to a place where he was wanted for murder, to have the audacity to go up to the Pharaoh and say, you know what, you need to let my people out of slavery. To Jesus, who just complimented Peter for recognizing his role and calling him the very rock on which he would build his church. Having to tell him, you need to stop thinking that you understand my call or the direction I'm taking you in, because that's not what it is. That's not easy. For the people for whom there's already crime in their neighborhoods in the park next door, for people who have gotten away from dangerous situations or horrible family situations with people that remind them unflatteringly of what they may be facing again, doesn't change the fact that God is at work in the work of Trinity Center. God is at work at St. Paul's in the outreach and the love that we care for each other with. So what is it like for us to continue to follow a God who promises love, but doesn't always promise safety and comfort? Not all of what we do is challenge and struggle and strife. But in the words of Sarah Miles, one of my mentors, come as you are, exactly as you are. But if you keep coming back, you will not stay the same. God's calling on our lives is first and foremost to our relationships to one another. The people that we want to wring their necks. Anyone have people in mind that they can think of that makes them want to wring their necks? Yes. Good. Good. That makes you human, alive, and actually means you care about something. Those are the people that we are called to love. Those are the people that we are called to serve beyond the people that we like ourselves. How do we have compassion for the people that we think are threatening what makes us feel safe? How do we have compassion for the people that refuse to change when they need to? How do we have compassion for ourselves when we beat ourselves up relentlessly for things that we might not need to beat ourselves up for? How do we stay in relationship to a God that makes us angry at times? Anyone ever yelled at God? Anyone ever been afraid to yell at God? You know what? That's what I like about our Bible is you get to talk back to God. I think that any relationship where you don't have room to be honest is not a loving relationship. That is the beauty of our God. God gets the last word usually, but he lets us share our peace. So may we continue to recognize that I am who I am, the very combination of noun and verb in one word, being itself, isness, I am, is the source from which each and every one of us comes, whether friend or enemy. And that our common thread, like the Eucharist, is not in our agreement, but in the shared thing that unites us, and that is our source in God. We are nourished by God through the Eucharist. That is an embodiment of what we are called to today in this collection of readings, is to continue to look deeper in how we can find God in the person whose neck we wish to wring, as well as the person that we go to for comfort. How do we love our enemies? How do we allow God to continue to lead us in love into places that we did not expect, that we did not hope, that are not often fair, but yet are aimed towards the goal of uniting all of us and reconciling all of us in the love of God? May we continue in that process today. Amen.